Honored to be joined by Matt Reeves. We're here to talk about the Batman. Matt, thanks for doing the show. Last time we spoke was almost 4 years ago. We were coming off this 6-7 year odyssey of motion capture and visual effects on the Planet of the Apes films.
You know what? That would be 5 years ago.
5? Wow.
2017. Because took me. I signed on to this movie when I was finishing War, and it took 5 years until the pandemic and the whole craziness of the world. And so, yeah, it was 5 years ago we must have spoken.
Mind-blowing. So it's been 5 years. I couldn't help but notice that this film has a slightly different feel than the Apes films. Did that meaningfully, essentially, make you want to make a film that was more grounded, more real, more textured because of that experience?
Well, what's interesting, my attempt in those films was to ground them. And to me, I tried to put them in an emotional space that I understood, because what I found so exciting about those sort of films, I mean, it's weird, like Batman, I love them since I was a kid, but there's something about both of these franchises that actually is the same, which is it's an opportunity to look at the characters from a psychological standpoint and to really look at human nature. I mean, the Apes films was so much about sort of our relationship to violence and to the animal side of us. And Batman is such a, because of the corruption of Gotham, and how what has formed Batman is really a traumatic experience. It's a psychological story. He's really doing it. You can look at it, as a superhero story, which of course he's doing what he's doing to make the city a better place. But he's really doing that from a very personal place, which is that it's the only way he can make sense of his life. He's in a kind of, especially in this one where my idea was to make him be an early years Batman. He hasn't gotten this worked out at all. And he doesn't know if it's going to work. And in fact, the truth is, Gotham being what Gotham is, in a certain sense, it isn't going to work. Gotham will always be corrupt. Gotham, there will always be crime. And Batman, I mean, it's in that way, it's very real, right? I mean, we know there's ebb and flow in the amount of corruption and crime in cities, but it's always there because it's human nature. And so the currency of both of the franchises was human nature. It's just that I was able to take this one because the fantastical element was that he was Batman. But the truth is, Batman already is not a fantastical element because he is not a superhero. He doesn't have powers. What he has is a super heroic will. What has happened to him as a child has so traumatized him that he is willing to do anything in order to try and make sense of what happened to him. And he's never going to fix it, right? No matter what he does, he's in a certain way, he's revisiting the ghosts of his past every night. He's looking for a fight. He wants to try and change what is unchangeable. And so he will always be haunted by that. And what I wanted in this story was I wanted to deal with that idea of what was driving him in a way that was very Jungian. He has this kind of like shadow side, really. And he's not, as much as he wants to think he's doing this to make the city better, it's really for himself also to make sense of his life. And I don't think he understands the degree to which he's driven in this way that's really a personal vendetta. And that's why he begins in this one. He doesn't say, I'm Batman like the Burton movies. He says, I'm vengeance, which does come from the comics and from the animated series. And I thought, well, what I'd love to do is I'd like to see him have an awakening over the course of the story. So he starts to understand that he has to be more, that he has to change, that it's not enough to take this path of vengeance and take you on that journey. And in a certain way, have him have an awakening that takes him out of being stuck in a place really of being 10 years old in a certain way. There are so many ways in which he's kind of naive. And the story and the elements, even his relationship with Selena Kyle, they're all kind of an awakening for him. And so I guess that's really, my long sort of rambling answer about what was important to me was to use the psychology of this character and to ground it in a way where Gotham, because Gotham is like our world, felt like our world and felt like our world now. I mean, that's the whole idea of the kind of social media and the social media mob and all of that the Riddler uses. Like I wanted it to sort of connect so that the audiences would be able to see a character that's beloved to them, but in a way that felt fresh, but also relevant for now.
I want to ask you about some of those things, but I'm curious, from the very first shot of the film, we're seeing a lot of images that are blurred and obscured. And this is pretty significantly different from not just most superhero movies, but most movies in general, which sort of feel like hyper real now. And especially big budget films. So I'm curious about that decision and maybe why you wanted the film to look this way.
Well, to me, what I for me, what I'm excited about when I go to the movies and for what I'm trying to do, it's weird. In this way, I identify with Batman, which is, for me, movie making, and it's been this way because I started making movies when I was a kid. And it was always a way for me, I didn't realize it as a kid, but I realize it now. It's a way for me to make sense, to make meaning. And so I'm trying to, even when I'm doing a kind of blockbuster film, it has to be personal for me. If it isn't personal and I can't connect in that way, I can't sort of attune my compass so that I can be the leader of this project. And I can't tell whether or not, I always want to draw in the creativity of my collaborators, but I have to be the compass to say, wait, we're going in the right direction or we're the wrong direction, or I won't know where to put the camera. I won't know all of those things unless it feels very personal. And the thing that makes sense to me and what cinema means for me is this idea that you have a kind of empathic relationship with the characters. And in that sense, that kind of comes from Hitchcock, right? This idea that you put the camera in the point of view of the characters, and so that you can walk in those characters' shoes, even as they do things that you'd like to think that you would never do, or they're doing things that you don't think you'd be brave enough to do. I want you to be in an emotional reality where you say, God, if I was in that position, would I do those things? So there's a kind of almost provocative sort of relationship that the camera puts you in. And so I've done that in everything that I've done, but I wanted to take it to even more extremes in terms of grounding this, so that on the one hand, it's got a very Hitchcockian kind of point of view approach, which I knew was appropriate not only emotionally, but also because I wanted it to be a psychological thriller and a detective story, and all of those things kind of work sort of for that. But we also wanted to take something that could feel very sort of almost too clean. Everything's done digitally today, right? And so what Greg and I talked about was trying to make a Gotham that felt very visceral. I wanted you to feel, when you're doing a kind of Hitchcockian thing, the thing is about subjectivity. So the sound and visuals all need to make you feel like you're in it, and so that you can feel like you're immersed. It's one of the reasons why I'm excited for people to see this on the big screen. And so, for me, I've always felt, and I did this, in the Apes films as well, and we did it when Greg and I worked together for the first time on Let Me In, the idea of what you can't quite see is as important as what you do see. And so there's a lot of stuff that's off camera, but there's also a lot of stuff within the frame that is soft. There's a lot of stuff that you can see what you're meant to focus on, but there's also that sense of the uncanny, of something that is just out of focus. And in a movie like this too, where I wanted it to have a kind of horror bent, sometimes what's out of focus and what you can't quite see is the most terrifying, because then you are filling it in as the audience. Like Hitchcock always talked about how in the shower scene, he was very careful. You don't ever see the knife piercing the skin, but you feel like you're experiencing that assault. And all of that is created by the audience engaging in that visual in such a way that you fill in the blanks. And I think we wanted to move in that way where you would fill in the blanks. And so the idea of what was in focus, what wasn't in focus, what even like I wanted the Batmobile to feel real. So I wanted to do it the way you would have done it in a 1970s chase, the way you would have done it in, like, let's say, The French Connection or Bullet. So I talked to Rob Alonzo about like camera positions. I said, I want to know everywhere we can put a camera, and I want to do hard mounts. I want this to feel like when the camera is on the side of the car and the car is shaking, the camera shakes. When we drive through water, the water gets on the lens, and like that, along with the texture that Greg brought, because not only do we use anamorphic lenses, but we used lenses deliberately that the camera house thought were bad. Like the quality that we wanted, they were like, well, technically, this is not really as sharp as it should be on the edges. And we were like, perfect, that's great. And we tried to introduce as many ways as possible to take what you would sort of see in today's super pristine, ultra clear, hyper real, as you would say, photography, and bring in elements that were more evocative of what you would see if you were making this movie, let's say, in the era when I came of age, when I was watching movies of like the 70s, with like, The French Connection, all that kind of stuff, where we even did a thing which Greg started on Dune, but we took further, where we took the finished digital image and we ran it out to film, and then we scanned it back. But we didn't do, in Dune, they did a thing where they ran the negative and they pulled it back. We did it also in IP, so that it was one further generation away, and we did, bleach bypass, and we wanted the movie to look like it had been shot in the vein of those kind of 70s movies. And it was all about bringing in a texture that made you feel more immersed, that didn't feel like something you could sort of put on a shelf and admire and sort of say like, okay, super clean, super pristine. It's just we wanted to feel like we were putting the audience in it.
So the design of the production does a lot of that work too. You mentioned.
Oh, totally. I mean, James Chinlin, who I worked with since the first Apes movies the first Ape movie that I did, Dawn. On that movie, I had a very unique experience that now I've had ever since then, because that experience I found to be so satisfying from a creative standpoint, which is that because Rupert Wyatt was starting that movie, James was already on. And there was a period of time where, I came in with a new story and they were like, oh, well, you should see if you like James, he's already on. But to be doing a movie and crafting a story while the production designer is already on is an incredible luxury. And it was so productive in that James and I have done it ever since. So when I was writing this movie, James and I would be in constant communication. I would send him pages and we would be talking about, okay, so what should Wayne Manor look like? And we talked about this idea of, instead of it being sort of like a Wayne Manor that you'd seen that was sort of away from the city and almost in a sort of countrified area, we wanted to take it to what was traditionally Wayne Enterprises hub, which would be like a sort of tall building, but make it like a Gothic building that might have been a place where the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers might have lived, founding families like in a city, an American city. And so we started those kind of conversations and we started talking about, well, what's the Bat Cave? And he was like, well, there's this legend about the Waldorf Astoria, that there's a private train line and that maybe some of these, industrialists had their own train lines. We thought, oh, that would be really cool. What if we have in the old foundation a no longer used, a disused sort of train station that was private for the Wayne Tower? They had their own private line and the Wayne cars, and that bats have gathered in here, and that's why it's the Bat Cave, but it also was actually an old train terminus specifically for the Waynes. And so that production design and the texture is something that began at the writing stage because James has been working with me. He's one of the first people on the movie actually with me, which and saw the way through. And I think that the work that he and his team did in this is like a new high watermark. I mean, I think it's just absolutely stunning work. We built the backlot that we built, where outside the Iceberg Lounge, James had this idea that the Iceberg Lounge could be in the footing of this old bridge. And that, and how that would work, and that Falcone could be above it and it would all be the thing. We built a huge section of the footing of that bridge, and we had it plumbed. Dom Tui, our amazing physical effects guy, like plumbed it with all this water. The set is constantly being rained. We had real cobblestones, and we used real photography and extended, the stuff that we were doing on our sets. And I think you look at that backlot, and it's inseparable from being a real city. I mean, and so James's work is just astonishing.
Yeah, you can smell it, you can feel it. All that stuff is really tremendous. Totally. You mentioned the 70s films and that sense of urban decay in those movies. There's a little bit of 90s serial killer, but the thing that really jumped out to me is this is really like a pretty brutal Bogart fatalist 40s detective movie.
Totally.
And that seems unlikely in the modern superhero enterprise. What kind of freedom did you have here? Did people tell you, like, this is pretty bleak at times, You know what?
I have to say that my experience making the movie with Warner Brothers was amazing in that they let me do it. And from the beginning, when I came in, I always come to these kinds of projects I'm very philosophical. Like, I happen to, the two franchises that I happen to be sort of, in my mind, right for, in that I have a connection that means something to me, actually were the Apes and Batman franchises. And the fact that they came my way is total serendipity. But I always approach that kind of experience by saying, like, look, these studios own these characters, right? So I have to respect that. So if they don't like my version, then that's totally fine. So I always begin saying, like, look, you might not like this, but that also means that I'm not going to do something you don't like, meaning I won't do the movie then, and that's okay. Like, my thing on this movie was, when I came in, I said, I want to do the movie in this way, and if you don't want that, please don't hire me. And they did. They were like, look, we do want this. They had to wait for me, in fact, to do it, because I was finishing Apes. And that, that was, they kept true to that, because, one of the things that's so unique about this character is that he's been around for over 80 years, and that quality you're talking about of the kind of noir, it is what the story was created. And he was created, in response to Superman, which is such a sort of, American dream kind of story, very optimistic. And Bob Kane and Bill Finger tried to come up with a kind of response to that was totally born out of World War II and the noir sensibility and the world's greatest detective. And so there was a kind of fatalism that was built into what this character is. And that's the seeds of it. That's the genesis. And so to be able to look backward, I love that you say that, because in my mind, I thought, gosh, we have a way, and it's sort of perfect that it is Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers made sort of the iconic gangster movies. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I kind of feel like this is a throwback in a certain way. And I think to create a Gotham where like all of it just exists, that we're in this year 2 Batman. And if you could imagine if you went down certain back alleys that you would come across the Sydney Green streets or whatever, but instead it's going to be, Oz, it's going to be the Penguin. You're going to see him. Like the idea of sort of creating a tapestry that felt like an old Warner Brothers gangster movie was absolutely the intention. The first sort of point of inflection was this idea, because I wanted to do World's Greatest Detective mode that would intersect with like Chinatown and sort of The French Connection and that kind of stuff, which were the movies that kind of inspired me to want to be a filmmaker in the first place. And I did see this kind of connection, but I did see it going back all the way to that kind of like, 30s, 40s thing in a way that obviously couldn't be anachronistic. I didn't want it to be that way, but I love that you can feel those roots, because that was something we were absolutely conscious of, while at the same time wanting to make that world totally contemporary. Because the whole idea of like, the way that the kind of viral aspect and sometimes corrosive aspect of social media, how the Riddler could use that to inflame people, the idea of the mob mentality that can sort of build online and how that can sort of have this kind of insidious effect. Like, I wanted to make sure that while we were doing all these things that were part of the history of Batman, that an audience coming to it would also recognize this Gotham as being part of our world.
So I want to ask you a little bit more about that specifically. Obviously, you started writing this film a number of years ago. Yeah. That mob mentality, that concept of the kind of conspiratorial online madness that we're all kind of living amongst has ratcheted up significantly since you started writing. Yeah. At any point, do you have any regrets about applying to some of these things? Do you have to modulate the story you're telling so you don't feel like you've gone in a direction that is astray from what you intended?
That's a great question, because I've been working on the story since 2017, and the script was done. Part of the reason why it took 5 years to do is really the pandemic. And so what was supposed to be, 6 or 8 months was like a year and a half in London. We were stuck there for months. And then we got back to making the movie. And as the events that you're talking about kind of, there were all kinds of things that happened that suddenly felt like, it's funny, you set out to set Gotham in a way that almost feels extreme. I was trying to ground it. I wanted it to feel like, in my mind, there were references that were like Watergate. We were doing stuff there's a way in which I see Batman and Gordon as being Woodward and Bernstein, and that they're on the trail of trying to understand where this corruption is and how this sort of corruption leads all the way to the top and how all of that works. And so there were historical things in that sense. It was sort of real, but you're hoping that there's a heightened nature to this, and that the whole point is that Gotham is pretty extreme. And it was one of these things where the world, in a weird way, seemed to kind of catch up. And there were certain moments where we were going like, oh my gosh, is the real world in certain ways worse than Gotham? That was kind of an unsettling moment. And there was a moment I remember specifically where we stood together as cast and crew shooting this scene where Jamie Lawson, who plays Bella Real, near the end of the film, after everything that's happened, is talking about having to rebuild the city. And she said, we have to rebuild, but not just our city. We have to rebuild our faith in each other, in our institutions. And there was something that was very heartbreaking about the idea that what we were talking about was Gotham, but somehow that felt true to us about the world. And so it was a very, we were definitely conscious of it. And I think that had things aligned even more directly, I think I would have felt the imperative to change things. I felt that they hadn't gotten so close. I would never have done something where something that was so recent would be something that we would deliberately grab and use, because I think that would be exploitive. So we didn't do that, but there are ways in which certain things seem to unsettlingly kind of feel close, but never, I think, so close that you can't see that this is our fictional world and it's not the real world. And so we didn't change anything, but we were certainly aware that the resonance had sort of somehow gotten deeper as events of the world sort of carried forward from, where we started from. It was startling. Look, everything moves in kind of like, you swing both ways and you have it's like a pendulum, right? It goes one way and then it comes back the other. But, one of the things and why I think Gotham is so relevant, why Batman's so relevant, is corruption and crime is never not relevant, right? This is what we live with. It's human nature. And we're never going to transcend it. It's why Batman is never not going to be needed in Gotham, because there's no place, it's not reality to say that you could ever completely excise crime and corruption. But the degree to which things sort of swing toward the dark side, obviously sort of moves and ebbs and flows. And I want to believe that while there seems to be this intersection at the moment between our Gotham and the real world, that hopefully in the real world, things will start to swing back toward the light. And that's obviously the idea and the mission that Batman is on. And it's been a very interesting time as we've made this movie.
Fingers crossed on that sentiment, Matt.
Yeah.
There are some aspects of your story that are deeply faithful to the comic books and the animated series, as you said. But I think that the consciousness of Batman has become so definitively a movie product for people. And I think this is so, in some respects, radically different. How much are you concerned, or do you think about fan base anxiety and the idea of the constant attention on a movie that is this big? And what happens if you let people down? I mean, how does that affect your ability to make a film?
You know, what's funny is I seem to keep getting myself into this position. You know, when we made Cloverfield, I remember that this trailer came out on Transformers, you know, and it was a sensation. It was huge. And we made the trailer to prove to ourselves that we could make the movie, but we hadn't made the movie. So everyone was going like, what's this movie? And I was like, oh my God, there's all these expectations and we haven't shot the movie. I don't know what this movie is. We're still in the process of making it, still discovering it. Can we do this? Will this work? And I remember thinking, wow, this is a lot of expectation to be put onto something that we haven't made yet. And that was really daunting. And then when I came into the Apes movies, I remember that, like, you know, I know that people were surprised by how wonderful Rupert Wyatt's first edition of that. They thought, oh, you can't do a reboot of, how could you do this thing? But that the conception of that story and centering around Caesar was such a wonderful thing. And then I know that everyone at that time was saying like, well, this was a surprise and you won't be able to do it twice. And then we didn't just do it twice, we did it 3 times. So it was like that, there was that. And even when I was doing Let Me In, like when I agreed to do the movie, I had been resistant because I loved the film that Thomas Alfredson made with John Lindquist. And I actually wrote to Lindquist and said, look, you know, I initially turned this down, but I realized of all the things I can do, this feels like the most personal because I grew up, I'm the same age as you, in the same era. And I wonder if I can translate this into a different sort of, you know, place and put it into, make it sort of, instead of a Swedish myth, an American myth. And he said to me, I want you to do this. I love Cloverfield. So he urged me to do it. But as I started making the movie when I signed on hadn't yet even come out. So as we were making the movie, that movie came out and it became kind of a cult legend. People were like, oh my God, it was beloved. And I thought, we are dead. We are so dead. So when I was doing the Batman movie, of course I was thinking, well, okay, here we are again. Like, we're dead. But this time I would say I took it, you know, eyes open, which is you can't take on a Batman movie without being aware that there have been great Batman films. And I love the Batman films. So it's one of these things where what you do is you say, okay, can I bring something new to it? Can we do something different? And that was the challenge, and that was what I wanted to do. It's why I took it on. I was like, okay, this is a character I've loved since I was a kid, and I've loved these Batman films. And I feel like, of course, you have to give the audience, there are certain expectations you have to fulfill. You can't not have an immersive, propulsive, somehow startling, great Batmobile chase. So I knew we had to try to do that. I knew we needed to have him fight in a certain way, and we needed some level of spectacle that said, okay, you're in a Batman movie. So that's the baseline. But I knew that wouldn't be enough, that if you couldn't find a way, after there being so many iterations, you also have to prove to an audience that there's a reason to revisit this. And so this idea of leaning into a very point of view driven story that was going to be a world's greatest detective story, and that we were going to take not an origin tale. I knew I couldn't do that. That had been done so many times really well too. We couldn't possibly see Martha's pearls on the cement again. I was like, well, what if we did an early days Batman who still had a lot to learn, who still had a place where you could take him and put him through the crucible of this experience of trying to solve this mystery that could turn very personal, and that the movie could be an awakening for him. I thought, well, we haven't seen that level of this kind of intimate sort of relationship to not Bruce becoming Batman, but to Batman being Batman, and Batman kind of really being, in a way, driven by his shadow side and not aware of everything he was doing, so that he was really acting in a kind of instinctual way. I felt like, okay, I think if we could do that and then introduce all of these characters in a way that feel fresh and new, that could be a really interesting new and fresh take that could warrant another movie. And that's what we set out to do. But you can't, of course, the horrifying thing is you start writing, and as I'm writing, suddenly I start seeing the thing that's there every day as you're walking down the street, but you don't really notice because it's not what you're doing. I suddenly would see babies in onesies with the bats, symbol on it, and people in their t-shirts and in their sweatshirts and wearing their baseball caps, and you go like, oh wow, like I know I love Batman, but I realize this is serious. Like
people love Batman.
If you look when you look on Twitter, you're like going, people are fighting about Batman, and I was like, okay. There's nothing you can do other than fight for your own version and know that, look, for this moment, I am custodian. We are custodians for this character. And you really hope that people will connect to this version. And what's exciting for me is some people, this will be their first iteration, just as, for me, it was Adam West. And to me, what's really exciting is the idea of somebody discovering this character for the first time, and it's going to be Rob's amazing portrayal. So that's really cool.
That's cool. So a couple quick ones for you. You've been working in franchise entertainment for a long time now. Do you want to keep making these movies? You seem to have set this movie up to keep making these movies.
Oh, you mean do I want to keep making films in this sort of Batverse?
Yeah,
totally.
Also even in franchise in general.
Oh, in franchises. Look. Here's the thing. What's so interesting is when I began making movies and TV, I never thought I would be a franchise filmmaker. I didn't think I would be a genre filmmaker. And the industry has changed so dramatically. I thought I would have been, in my early days, I wanted myself to make movies in the mold of like Hal Ashby comedies or something. I thought I would make this kind of poignant, sad comedy kind of thing. Or I thought I would certainly, whatever it was, I knew I wanted to make personal films. And my path was such that I ended up that the opportunities for me ended up being in genre space. And what I discovered, I knew it obviously as a viewer. I knew that I had loved genre movies when I was a kid, and what John Carpenter did with his remake of The Thing, and what so many what Hitchcock did, right? Hitchcock's personal obsessions find their way into all of these. Like you look at those, and his work at the time, people thought, oh, he just makes these suspense movies, but that work is all tremendously personal to him. And for me, it's not. I can't approach what I do unless I find a personal way in, because that's what tells me where to put the camera and how to talk to the actors. So what I found, really in making Cloverfield was that there's a way to be very personal under the guise of something that's very kind of spectacular and fantastical. And that the anxiety of that movie for me was very personal. That all felt very, very personal to me. And that was true, the idea in Let Me In, I grew up and was bullied much the way John Lindquist was. It was one of the things I was writing to him about. And that experience and trying to do that from a personal perspective, even though it was this genre story, I was like, wow, you can use these metaphors to be very, very personal. And the Apes films, for me, were very, very personal. It was a way to explore human nature. And Batman is sort of the same thing. So, on the one hand, would I ever want to do something that wasn't a franchise? For sure. The thing about the world and the way it is now is most likely that would have to be in the streaming space. And I'm sure that I will do something like that. I would love to. There's actually a project that I wrote that I was a movie that I wrote that I wanted to make when I was just before I did Cloverfield. And it was a really personal film that had a kind of Hitchcockian side of it, but again, was very, very personal. And I didn't end up getting to make it. It fell apart. And the chance then came to do Cloverfield. So I took that and I made that as personal as I could. And so I would love to make that movie one day. I'd love to make personal films for sure, but everything I do is personal. And I have to say that this experience of making this one, this is a unique thing to have a character that, look, what's left of the big screen experience at the moment seems to be these kinds of franchises, right? And so I love cinema. I love the idea of being able to draw something on that big canvas. And this is a really unique version of this character. Not just of this character, I'm not saying my own. What I mean is of a character being a superhero character, because this character from its inception, he's not a superhero in that traditional sense. He's a human, flawed character that allows exploration of the grays. And that idea of not just sort of trying to entertain in a way that also isn't somehow also looking at something that could feel personal and human, that's rare. And so I am happy to be here. And I would absolutely, should the audience engage and accept this version of the character, of course, I want to do more.
I'd like to see more. Matt, thanks for doing this.
Thanks
I really
so
appreciate
much.
this.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, man. Fun talking to you.